Sometimes the most dangerous thing a black woman can do in America is celebrate too loudly in the wrong neighborhood. The flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet suburban street in violent streaks of color as wedding guests froze mid-laughter beneath the soft glow of hanging lanterns. Music cut off abruptly. Forks stopped halfway to plates. Conversations died in the humid summer air. Alicia Brooks stood in the center of it all wearing a white satin gown that shimmered under the backyard string lights, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands as two patrol cars rolled to a stop in front of the house. A moment earlier, the night had felt perfect. Children chased each other across the grass with sparklers while old-school jazz drifted through the warm Georgia evening. The scent of barbecue and fresh roses lingered in the air. Families hugged. Friends laughed. And Alicia had just taken her first step down the candlelit aisle her fiancé built with his own hands that morning. But now every eye turned toward the arriving officers. Officer Daniel Harper stepped out of the cruiser slowly, one hand resting near his belt as if he expected danger instead of a wedding reception. The porch lights reflected against his sunglasses even though the sun had already set nearly 20 minutes ago. His expression tightened the second he scanned the crowd, especially when he noticed who filled it. Black families dressed in elegant suits and pastel dresses. Elderly couples dancing barefoot on the lawn. Young men helping elders carry trays of food. To anyone else, it looked like joy. To Harper, it looked like suspicion. He walked forward with stiff authority, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway while the guests instinctively moved aside. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, a nervous child squeezed his mother's hand tighter. Alicia swallowed hard as Harper approached her directly, barely even acknowledging the decorations, the wedding arch, or the minister still standing awkwardly beside the aisle. "Who's in charge here?" he asked sharply. The question hung heavy in the silence. Alicia blinked once before answering carefully. "This is my wedding officer." Harper looked her up and down slowly, not with admiration, with judgment, the kind that made her skin feel cold despite the 82-degree heat. "We received reports of a disturbance," he said. "Multiple calls." Murmurs spread through the guests. Alicia's mother Denise stepped forward immediately, her pearl earrings catching the light as concern filled her face. "A disturbance?" she repeated softly. "This is a private wedding reception." Harper ignored her. His eyes stayed fixed on Alicia like she personally offended him by existing there. "Do you have a permit for this gathering?" he asked. Alicia hesitated. "We checked county regulations. We were told private family events under this size didn't require one." Harper tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. "Funny," he muttered. Neighbors described something very different. A cold breeze seemed to pass through the yard, even though the air had been still all evening. Alicia noticed guests exchanging uncomfortable looks, phones slowly lowering, smiles disappearing, and then she saw her. Across the street, Linda Whitmore standing behind her perfectly trimmed hedge with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Watching, satisfied. The same neighbor who had complained about noise when Alicia's family unloaded folding chairs that afternoon. The same woman who stared too long every time Marcus visited the house after work. Alicia felt her stomach tighten. Harper took another step closer. "We got reports of shouting, possible public intoxication, and aggressive behavior." A few guests looked stunned. One older man actually laughed under his breath in disbelief before quickly stopping himself. Alicia's voice stayed calm, but barely. "Officer, no one here is causing trouble." Harper glanced around again. "That's not what I'm seeing." The words landed harder than they should have, because everyone there understood what he meant. The music, the crowd, the skin color, the fact that joy coming from black families somehow sounded threatening to certain people behind closed curtains. Alicia's fingers tightened around the bouquet until tiny white petals bent beneath her grip. She had dreamed about this day since she was 16 years old. Not a ballroom wedding, not something extravagant, just love, family, peace. One safe night where everybody she cared about could exist without tension crawling into the room. But now humiliation spread through her chest like ice water. Harper looked toward the DJ booth. "Shut the music off completely." "It's already off," the DJ answered quietly. Harper ignored him too. Then his gaze returned to Alicia. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the crowd while we sort this out." The backyard fell completely silent. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled low across the dark Georgia sky. And for the first time all night, Alicia realized this wasn't about noise complaints at all. The silence after Officer Harper's words felt heavier than the humid night air pressing down over the neighborhood. Alicia slowly stepped away from the wedding aisle exactly as instructed, her heels sinking slightly into the soft grass, while dozens of eyes followed her movement in stunned disbelief. Somewhere behind her, the string lights continued swaying gently in the warm breeze, glowing gold against the darkness like the evening itself still refused to believe what was happening. Denise Brooks immediately moved beside her daughter, protective instinct written all over her face. "Officer, this is unnecessary," she said carefully. "Nobody here has done anything wrong." Harper did not even look at her. His attention remained fixed on Alicia as though she alone represented the entire situation. "Ma'am, I need cooperation tonight," he replied flatly. "That makes things easier for everybody." Easier. The word echoed bitterly in Alicia's chest. She could already feel phones recording from different corners of the yard, guests whispering quietly, older relatives trying to shield younger children from the tension building under the wedding lights. The beautiful atmosphere they spent weeks creating was dissolving minute by minute into embarrassment and fear. Harper motioned toward another officer standing near the patrol car. "Start checking the perimeter," he ordered. "Make sure nobody leaves." A nervous murmur spread instantly through the guests. One young man in a navy suit raised his eyebrows in disbelief. "Nobody leaves," he repeated softly. "This is a wedding, not a crime scene." Harper turned sharply toward him. "You got something you want to add?" The young man immediately looked down, jaw tightening as older family members gently pulled him back before the situation escalated further. Alicia closed her eyes briefly. She hated this feeling. The feeling that one wrong sentence could suddenly turn ordinary people into threats in someone else's imagination. Across the yard, Linda Whitmore remained standing near her hedge like a spectator at a show she paid to see. Her porch light illuminated the smug satisfaction on her face while she pretended to speak quietly into her cell phone. Alicia remembered the first day she met her 3 months earlier. Linda had smiled politely at first, asked questions about parking, about noise, about how many people would be visiting regularly once Alicia got married. Questions that sounded harmless until they started stacking together. Little comments wrapped in fake friendliness. Alicia should have recognized the warning signs sooner. Harper stepped closer again, lowering his voice just enough to sound more threatening than loud. "We received reports that this gathering was getting out of control." Alicia stared at him in disbelief. People were dancing. Neighbors felt unsafe. Unsafe. There it was again. That coded language people used when they wanted to say something uglier without actually saying it aloud. Denise folded her arms tightly. "Unsafe because black families are celebrating?" she asked quietly. Several guests looked down immediately after she said it. Nobody wanted the words spoken openly, even though everybody already felt it hanging over the yard like smoke. Harper's expression hardened. "Do not put words in my mouth." But he did not deny it either. A distant flash of lightning briefly illuminated the neighborhood, while thunder rolled somewhere miles away. The air smelled like incoming rain now, thick and electric. Alicia noticed one of the younger officers scanning the crowd nervously. Unlike Harper, he looked uncomfortable, confused even. His eyes kept drifting toward the luxury sedan parked near the curb across the street, then toward several sharply dressed men standing silently near the reception tables. Men with military posture. Men who carried themselves with quiet authority even without uniforms. Something about the scene clearly was not matching whatever story Harper expected when he answered the 911 call. But Harper remained too focused on control to notice. "I need identification from the hosts," he said suddenly. Alicia blinked. For what reason? Standard procedure. At a private wedding? Harper took another slow step toward her. "You want to cooperate or not?" Denise inhaled sharply beside her daughter, but Alicia gently touched her mother's arm first. She could already feel the pressure building around them. One wrong emotional reaction, and suddenly the narrative would change completely. Suddenly, they would become the problem instead of the humiliation happening right in front of everybody. Alicia carefully handed over her identification with trembling fingers. Harper studied it longer than necessary. "You live here?" "Yes." "And your fiancé?" Alicia hesitated for half a second. "He lives here too." Harper glanced around the yard again. "Where is he?" Before Alicia could answer, The sound of footsteps approached slowly from behind the house. Calm, measured, unhurried. The kind of footsteps belonging to someone who was not afraid of the situation unfolding around him. Several guests immediately straightened. Others exchanged knowing glances. And then Marcus Reed finally appeared beneath the hanging lanterns wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his expression unreadable as his eyes landed first on Alicia, then on Officer Harper standing directly in front of her. The entire backyard seemed to shift the moment Marcus Reed stepped beneath the lantern lights. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a change in air pressure before a storm finally breaks. His tuxedo jacket rested perfectly across broad shoulders that carried years of discipline without needing to announce it. Rain clouds rolled slowly above the neighborhood, casting low shadows over the reception while Marcus walked across the grass with measured calm, his polished shoes barely making a sound. Alicia felt her breathing steady the second she saw him. Not because she expected him to rescue the situation with anger or authority, but because Marcus had always carried a kind of stillness that made chaos feel temporary. Even now, with 2 patrol cars parked outside their wedding and guests standing frozen in uncomfortable silence, he did not rush. He did not panic. He simply walked toward her. Officer Harper turned as Marcus approached, clearly irritated by the interruption before immediately slipping back into the same cold professionalism. "Sir," Harper said firmly, "I need everybody to remain cooperative while we investigate the complaint." Marcus stopped beside Alicia first. His eyes softened briefly as he looked at her trembling hands, still clutching crushed white flower petals. A small crease formed in his forehead when he noticed the humiliation in her expression. Then his attention slowly shifted toward Harper. "What complaint?" he asked calmly. His voice was deep, controlled, almost gentle. Harper straightened slightly. Neighbors reported suspicious activity, excessive noise, possible public intoxication. Several guests exchanged exhausted looks. One elderly aunt quietly shook her head under her breath. Marcus glanced around the yard once. Empty wine glasses, half-eaten slices of wedding cake, children sitting silently beside confused parents. A jazz playlist paused mid-song. Then he looked back at Harper. "This is a wedding reception," Marcus said evenly. "Not a disturbance." Harper's jaw tightened. "Sir, we decide what qualifies as a disturbance." Alicia immediately sensed the shift in tension around them. Not because Marcus reacted emotionally. He did not. That was what made it stranger. Most people in situations like this either exploded or shrank. Marcus did neither. He simply stood there with his hands relaxed at his sides while the storm clouds above reflected dim flashes of lightning against the neighborhood rooftops. Harper glanced toward Alicia again. "Your fiancé was unable to provide a permit." "Because private family events in this county do not require one," Marcus answered. Before Alicia could speak, Harper paused for half a second. Something about Marcus's tone seemed to irritate him more than resistance would have. It was confidence without confrontation, calm without submission. "Do you live here, sir?" Harper asked. "Yes." Identification. The request landed hard in the silence. Denise inhaled sharply beside Alicia while several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances again. Marcus reached slowly into his tuxedo jacket without breaking eye contact. Even the younger officer standing near the cruiser appeared tense now, his gaze moving repeatedly between Marcus and Harper like he sensed something approaching that Harper still could not see. Marcus handed over his wallet calmly. Harper took the identification card with visible impatience, barely glancing down at first. But then his expression changed. Only slightly. A flicker. His eyes moved back to the card again. Then back to Marcus. The younger officer noticed it immediately. Alicia noticed too. Harper's posture stiffened almost invisibly beneath the porch lights. Marcus Reed stood silently while Harper reread the identification a second time. The sounds of distant thunder rolled lower now across the Georgia sky. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes clinked softly on a neighbor's porch. Nobody at the wedding moved. Nobody spoke. Harper finally cleared his throat. "Captain Reed." The title slipped out before he could stop it. The backyard froze completely. Even Linda Whitmore across the street visibly straightened behind her hedge when she heard the name. Marcus remained calm. "That is correct." Harper blinked once, almost like his brain needed another second to catch up with reality. The man standing in front of him was not just another black homeowner hosting a loud party. He was his captain. The same commanding officer whose leadership briefings every patrol unit attended downtown. The same decorated veteran whose photo hung inside the precinct hallway beside the city commendation plaque. The same man Harper himself had stood and saluted less than 72 hours earlier. Alicia watched the color slowly drain from Harper's face beneath the flashing patrol lights. For the first time all night, the officer looked uncertain. Not because Marcus raised his voice, not because anybody threatened him, but because the entire story he built in his head the second he arrived on that street was collapsing in real time. Marcus took one slow step closer. Still calm, still composed. "Officer," he said quietly, "would you like to explain why my wife was being separated from her own wedding guests?" Officer Harper opened his mouth once, then closed it again as the reality of the situation settled over him like cold rain. The flashing patrol lights no longer felt powerful standing against the wedding decorations and glowing lanterns. They felt exposed, harsh, almost embarrassing. Around the backyard, guests who moments earlier stood tense and uncertain now watched silently, with a completely different expression. The fear was gone, replaced by recognition. Harper glanced down at the identification card in his hand again, as if somehow the name might change if he looked hard enough. Captain Marcus Reed, Precinct Operations Division, 22 years of service, multiple commendations. His throat tightened slightly. The younger officer near the cruiser straightened immediately, visibly uncomfortable now that he realized exactly whose wedding they had interrupted. Marcus remained perfectly calm, but there was something in his stillness that carried more weight than anger ever could. "Officer," Marcus repeated quietly, "I asked you a question." Harper finally handed the identification back with stiff fingers. "Captain, I did not realize this residence belonged to you." Marcus accepted the card without even glancing at it. "That does not answer my question." The backyard remained silent except for distant thunder rolling through the clouds overhead. Somewhere near the reception tables, a candle flickered in the wind before going out completely. Harper shifted his weight awkwardly. "We received a complaint regarding suspicious activity," he said carefully now, choosing each word with sudden caution. "Neighbors reported the gathering appeared aggressive." Alicia looked down for a moment, pain flashing across her face. Aggressive. That word again. As though dancing, music, laughter, and black families celebrating love automatically transformed into danger in certain people's minds. Marcus noticed it immediately. He turned slightly toward Alicia, his expression softening just enough for her to breathe easier again before his attention returned to Harper. "Did you witness aggressive behavior when you arrived?" Marcus asked. Harper hesitated. "No, sir." "Did you witness intoxication?" "No, sir." "Any physical altercation?" "No, sir." Every answer seemed to shrink him further beneath the glowing porch lights. Marcus nodded once. Calm. Controlled. "Then why was my wife being isolated from her guests?" Harper swallowed visibly this time. Across the street, Linda Whitmore slowly lowered her cell phone, suddenly looking far less confident than before. The younger officer near the patrol car shifted uncomfortably and finally spoke for the first time all evening. "Captain Reed, sir, I think there may have been a misunderstanding with the call." Harper shot him a quick look, but the damage was already done. Misunderstanding. The word hung heavily over the entire street. Alicia looked around at the decorations she spent months planning. The white roses lining the aisle. The handwritten name cards at each dinner table. The jazz band quietly packing up instruments after being forced to stop mid-song. She thought about how quickly joy could be interrupted when certain people decided your happiness looked suspicious. Denise folded her arms tightly beside her daughter, eyes shining with restrained emotion. "This was supposed to be the happiest night of her life," she said quietly. Nobody answered her. Because there was nothing to say, Marcus slowly turned his gaze toward the neighboring house across the street. Linda instinctively stepped backward from the hedge when his eyes met hers for the first time. He did not glare at her, did not threaten her. Somehow that made it worse. "Which neighbor placed the complaint?" Marcus asked calmly. Harper hesitated again. Department policy normally protected callers during active responses, but now every second felt heavier than the last. The younger officer finally answered instead. "The call came from the Whitmore residence, sir." Linda's face immediately drained of color. Several wedding guests turned toward her house in stunned disbelief while she awkwardly tried to retreat farther onto her porch. Marcus remained silent for a long moment. Rain finally began falling lightly against the pavement, soft drops tapping against parked cars and folding chairs. Alicia closed her eyes briefly as cold water touched her shoulders and veil. The night that was supposed to begin with vows and dancing had turned into humiliation under flashing police lights, because one woman looked across the street and saw black joy as a threat. Marcus exhaled slowly before looking back toward Harper. "Officer, do you know what happens when authority acts on assumptions instead of facts?" Harper said nothing. "People lose trust," Marcus continued quietly. "Not because of policy, because of moments exactly like this." The younger officer lowered his eyes. Even Harper could not maintain eye contact anymore. Marcus glanced around the yard at the children holding sparklers that had long since burned out. Elderly relatives standing silently in formal clothes beneath gathering rain. Alicia clutching crushed flower petals and shaking hands. "You did not just interrupt a wedding tonight," Marcus said softly. "You reminded every person standing here exactly why they still feel watched in neighborhoods they worked hard to live in." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Harper stood frozen beneath the flashing lights, while rain slowly darkened the shoulders of his uniform. For the first time all night, the badge on his chest no longer looked like authority. It looked heavy. Rain continued falling softly across the neighborhood, turning the warm summer wedding into a strange mixture of beauty and heartbreak beneath the glowing lanterns. Water collected on the white rose petals lining the aisle while guests quietly moved elderly relatives beneath tents and patio covers. Nobody spoke loudly anymore. The celebration had been cracked open, and even though no physical damage had been done, something emotional lingered heavily in the air. Officer Harper stood near the center of the yard with his shoulders tense, avoiding eye contact with almost everyone around him. The confidence he arrived with had vanished completely. In its place was the uncomfortable realization that every assumption he made tonight had been built before he even stepped out of the patrol car. Marcus Reed noticed it too, but he did not humiliate him. That was the part Harper seemed least prepared for. Marcus could have raised his voice, could have reminded everyone exactly who he was inside the department, could have made the officer feel small in front of the entire wedding party. Instead, Marcus simply stood beside Alicia and placed his suit jacket gently over her shoulders to shield her from the rain. That quiet gesture somehow carried more dignity than any speech ever could. Alicia looked up at him, emotion filling her eyes as mascara blurred slightly beneath the moisture on her cheeks. "I am sorry," she whispered softly. Marcus frowned immediately. "For what?" Her voice trembled. This night was supposed to be peaceful. Marcus looked around the backyard at the soaked tables, frightened children, and silent guests before looking back at her. "You did nothing wrong," he said firmly but gently. "Do not apologize for somebody else's prejudice." The words settled deeply into the crowd around them. Several older relatives nodded quietly. Denise turned away for a moment, blinking rapidly as she fought back tears she refused to let fall publicly. Across the street, Linda Whitmore remained frozen near her porch steps, realizing too late that the people she viewed as suspicious neighbors were respected members of the very community she claimed to protect. One of the wedding guests, an older black veteran named Walter Gaines, slowly stepped forward beneath the rain carrying 2 covered trays of untouched food from the buffet table. His gray suit clung damply to his shoulders as he looked directly at Harper. "You know," Walter said quietly, "I served this country for 27 years. Harper looked up cautiously. "Sir, Walter continued without anger, "bought my first house in 1983, worked double shifts, raised 3 daughters, paid taxes every year of my life." He glanced around the wedding slowly. "And somehow, every time black folks gather together peacefully, somebody still calls the police like celebration itself is suspicious." Nobody interrupted him, not even the rain. Harper's jaw tightened again, but not defensively this time. Shame was beginning to settle invisibly beneath his expression. The younger officer standing nearby finally removed his hat out of respect, water dripping from the brim as he quietly looked toward Marcus. "Captain Reed," he said carefully, "on behalf of the responding unit, I apologize for how this situation was handled." Harper looked toward his partner briefly, then back toward Marcus and Alicia. His throat moved slightly before he finally spoke. "Captain, Miss Brooks." The words came slowly, awkwardly. I should have assessed the situation more carefully before escalating it. Alicia studied him silently. The apology sounded professional, careful, but she could still hear the fear underneath it. Not fear of punishment, fear of realization. Fear that maybe the version of events he trusted automatically whenever certain neighborhoods called the police was not as neutral as he once believed. Marcus stepped closer, rainwater sliding slowly down the sleeves of his tuxedo. "Officer Harper," he said calmly, "do you know what my wife was worried about 10 minutes before you arrived?" Harper shook his head once. She was worried the cake would melt in the heat before the photographs. Several guests smiled faintly through the tension. Alicia lowered her eyes, embarrassed but emotional. Marcus continued quietly. That was her concern tonight. Not crime, not conflict, just whether her family would have beautiful memories. He glanced around at the silent crowd, and instead, everybody here got reminded how quickly joy can become suspicion depending on who is celebrating. Harper looked down at the wet grass beneath his boots. For the first time in years, his badge felt less like certainty and more like responsibility. Somewhere behind the clouds, thunder rolled again, softer now. The rain began slowing gradually into a gentle drizzle. Marcus turned toward Alicia and carefully took her hand again. "We still have a wedding to finish," he said softly. The guests remained quiet for one long second. Then Denise began clapping slowly through tears. One by one, others joined her until the sound spread across the backyard like warmth returning after a cold wind. Harper stood motionless beside the patrol car, while the family he had interrupted slowly reclaimed their night beneath the fading storm. The music returned slowly at first, almost uncertain whether it still belonged there after everything that had happened. Soft jazz drifted once again through the backyard speakers while guests cautiously reclaimed their seats beneath damp tents and glowing lanterns. Rainwater still clung to the edges of tablecloths and flower arrangements, but little by little the warmth of the evening began fighting its way back into the celebration. Alicia stood quietly near the wedding arch while Denise carefully adjusted the veil resting against her daughter's shoulders. "You still look beautiful," Denise whispered gently. Alicia gave a small emotional smile, though exhaustion lingered behind her eyes now. Some wounds did not leave bruises. Some simply settled inside a person and stayed there quietly. Across the yard, Officer Harper remained beside the patrol car with his hat tucked beneath one arm. The younger officer had already stepped away to speak into the radio, likely updating dispatch that the so-called disturbance had been resolved. But Harper barely heard any of it. His attention remained fixed on the wedding unfolding again in front of him. Children slowly returned to laughing. Couples resumed dancing carefully on the rain-soaked grass. The jazz band restarted their interrupted song from the beginning, as though trying to stitch the evening back together one note at a time. And standing at the center of it all was Marcus Reed. Calm, respected, loved. Harper felt something uncomfortable twisting deeper in his chest the longer he watched. Because the people standing in front of him tonight looked nothing like the picture he unconsciously built in his mind while driving to the call. He thought he was arriving to chaos. Instead, he found family. He thought he was stepping into danger. Instead, he interrupted love. The realization sat heavier than any disciplinary warning ever could. Nearby, Walter Gaines quietly approached Harper holding 2 paper cups of coffee beneath the covered patio area. Steam rose into the cool night air while droplets of rain tapped softly against the roof overhead. Harper looked surprised when Walter offered him one. "Sir, I do not think I deserve that right now," Harper admitted quietly. Walter shrugged slightly. "Maybe not," he said honestly. "But maybe tonight is not about punishment." Harper accepted the coffee slowly. Walter leaned against the wooden railing beside him, looking out toward the wedding guests dancing again under the lantern lights. "You know what hurts the most?" Walter asked after a long silence. Harper said nothing. "It is not always the obvious hatred." Walter's voice remained calm, reflective. "Sometimes it is realizing people only see danger because of who is standing in front of them." Harper stared down into the coffee cup, warming his hands. "I was responding to a call," he muttered weakly. Walter nodded once. "I believe you." Then he looked directly at him. "But somewhere between the radio dispatch and this backyard, your assumptions filled in the blanks before facts ever did." The words landed quietly, but deeply. Harper thought back to the moment he arrived. The loud music, the large black crowd, the expensive cars lining the street. He remembered how quickly suspicion came to him, how natural it felt. He hated that realization now more than he could explain. Across the yard, Marcus and Alicia finally returned beneath the wedding arch together. The minister smiled warmly despite the damp pages of his ceremony notes fluttering in the breeze. Guests gathered closer this time, almost protectively, as if refusing to let the night be stolen from them again. Marcus reached for Alicia's hands carefully. "Ready?" he asked softly. Alicia looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Now I am." Their guests smiled through lingering emotion while the ceremony resumed beneath the glowing lights. Harper watched silently from a distance as Alicia's voice trembled slightly during her vows. Not from fear anymore, from resilience. Every word carried the weight of a woman determined not to let humiliation become the final memory of her wedding night. Marcus listened to her with tears quietly forming in his own eyes while thunder faded farther into the distance beyond the neighborhood. Harper lowered his head slowly. He suddenly remembered another wedding years earlier. His sister's wedding. A small ceremony in Tennessee where nobody questioned whether his family belonged there. Nobody called the police because they celebrated too loudly. Nobody treated joy like suspicion. And for the first time in a very long time, Harper understood something painful. Privilege often sounded like silence. The silence of never having your happiness mistaken for a threat. Marcus slipped a wedding ring gently onto Alicia's finger while the guests applauded softly around them. The lantern lights reflected against wet grass like scattered gold beneath the dark sky. Harper stood completely still beside the patrol car as the applause echoed through the neighborhood. Then quietly, almost ashamed to hear the words leaving his own mouth, he whispered to himself, "I never saw it before tonight." The wedding reception slowly transformed back into something warm and alive as the night settled deeper over the neighborhood. Rain clouds drifted farther east, leaving behind cool air that carried the scent of wet grass, barbecue smoke, and fresh roses through the backyard. Lantern lights reflected softly against puddles along the stone walkway, while guests returned to their conversations with quieter voices and gentler laughter than before. The evening had changed them, not ruined them, changed them. Alicia sat beneath the covered patio beside Denise while cousins fixed the edges of her damp wedding dress with careful hands. Every now and then someone hugged her a little tighter than usual, as if silently apologizing for what she endured tonight without ever deserving it. She smiled politely through it all, but part of her still felt emotionally exhausted. Marcus noticed immediately, even while shaking hands with relatives and thanking guests for staying through the storm. His attention kept drifting back toward Alicia. That was how he loved people. Quietly. Constantly. He finally walked over carrying 2 slices of untouched wedding cake balanced carefully on small white plates. "You have not eaten anything in almost 3 hours, he said softly as he sat beside her. Alicia laughed weakly for the first time all evening. "I think getting questioned by police ruined my appetite a little." Marcus shook his head gently. "Then we reclaim the night one piece at a time." Denise smiled quietly beside them before standing up and touching Marcus's shoulder affectionately. "Take care of my girl," she whispered. Marcus looked at Alicia with calm certainty. Always. Across the street, Linda Whitmore remained standing near her darkened living room window, watching the wedding continue without interruption. The celebration she tried to stop had somehow become even stronger after surviving humiliation together. Every burst of laughter drifting across the street now sounded different to her. Heavier. Human. Real. For the first time, she noticed details she had ignored before. The elderly man helping fold chairs despite his cane. The little girls twirling barefoot in damp grass beneath lantern lights. The young black father carrying a sleeping toddler carefully against his chest while slow music played nearby. They were not suspicious strangers. They were neighbors. And somehow that realization unsettled her more than calling the police ever had. Back near the patrol cars, Officer Harper still had not left. The younger officer quietly handled the remaining paperwork alone while Harper stood watching the reception from beneath a maple tree near the curb. His uniform had dried slightly now, but the discomfort in his face remained visible. Marcus eventually approached him calmly with 2 folded napkins in one hand and a small plate of cake in the other. Harper looked genuinely confused when Marcus stopped beside him. "Captain," Marcus handed him the plate. Chocolate or vanilla was already gone. Harper hesitated before taking it slowly. You do not have to do this, he admitted quietly. Marcus looked out toward the wedding guests dancing beneath the lights. Maybe not, he said. But bitterness does not heal anything either. Harper stared down at the untouched cake for a moment. I embarrassed your wife tonight. Marcus nodded once. Yes. The honesty of the answer hurt more than anger would have. Harper swallowed hard. I thought I was doing my job. Marcus remained silent briefly before answering. A job can become dangerous when somebody stops seeing people clearly. The distant sound of slow jazz floated through the neighborhood, while guests began lighting fresh sparklers near the garden fence. Harper rubbed the back of his neck tiredly. I keep replaying it in my head, he admitted. The second I saw the crowd, I already decided what kind of situation it was. Marcus studied him carefully. Most prejudice does not begin with shouting, he said quietly. Sometimes it begins with assumptions people never challenge. Harper lowered his eyes again. The words settled deep because they were true. Marcus glanced toward Alicia, laughing softly now as her cousins pulled her back onto the dance floor. Her joy had returned slowly, but it had returned. You know the hardest part? Marcus asked. Harper looked up. She spent months planning tonight. Worried about flowers, music, seating charts, whether everybody would feel welcomed. He paused briefly. Meanwhile, she also carried another fear in the back of her mind the entire time. Harper already knew the answer before Marcus said it. That somebody would look at our celebration and see a threat instead of love. Silence settled between them beneath the cool Georgia night sky. Harper finally looked toward the backyard again. Not as an officer this time. Not as authority. Just as a man seeing clearly for the first time what other people had been forced to carry their entire lives. And somewhere beneath the lantern lights, Alicia looked up while dancing slowly with Marcus and realized something unexpected. The night had tried to humiliate them. Instead, it revealed exactly who stood beside them when dignity mattered most. The night deepened into something softer after midnight, the earlier tension slowly dissolving beneath music, candlelight, and the stubborn determination of a family refusing to let humiliation define their memories. The backyard glowed beneath rows of hanging lanterns that swayed gently in the cool Georgia breeze, while guests gathered closer together than before, almost instinctively protective of one another now. Children roasted marshmallows near a small fire pit, while older relatives wrapped themselves in blankets and shared stories beneath the covered patio. There was a different kind of warmth in the air now. Not carefree innocence. Something stronger. Resilience. Alicia stood near the dance floor holding Marcus's hand as soft jazz echoed through the neighborhood again. Her wedding dress had dried slightly at the hem, though faint grass stains still marked the bottom from where she had stood frozen earlier beneath police lights. She glanced down at them for a moment before Marcus noticed. Do you want to go inside and change? He asked quietly. Alicia shook her head slowly. No, Marcus studied her face carefully. You sure? She looked around the backyard at her family laughing again beneath the lanterns. I think I want to remember that the night kept going. Her words settled gently between them. Marcus smiled faintly before kissing her forehead softly. Nearby, Denise wiped away another emotional tear while pretending to rearrange dessert trays so nobody would notice. Across the yard, Walter Gaines sat beside several younger guests telling old military stories while thunder faded completely beyond the distant hills. The storm had passed now, but some storms left lessons behind after they moved on. Near the curb, Officer Harper finally prepared to leave. The younger officer had already returned to the cruiser, but Harper remained standing alone for a long moment beside the patrol car with his hands resting against the roof. He watched the wedding quietly, almost like he no longer trusted himself to interrupt spaces he did not fully understand. Marcus noticed him from across the yard and slowly walked over one final time. Harper straightened immediately. Captain. Marcus nodded once. Heading out. Harper glanced toward the celebration. Feels like this night belongs to your family again. Marcus looked toward Alicia laughing with her cousins beneath the lanterns. It always did. Harper exhaled slowly. Captain, I know saying sorry does not erase what happened. Marcus remained silent. Harper looked down briefly before continuing. But I keep thinking about how fast I judged everything when I arrived here. He rubbed his forehead tiredly. The music, the crowd, the neighborhood complaints. I never stopped to question why certain situations automatically feel suspicious to me. Marcus crossed his arms calmly against the cool night air. Most people do not question it, he admitted quietly. That is how bias survives for generations while everybody insists they are fair. Harper swallowed hard. The truth of those words sat painfully inside him now because he could no longer hide from it behind procedure or policy. He thought about how differently tonight might have unfolded if Marcus Reed had not been his captain. If Alicia had simply been another black woman celebrating in a backyard, would he have listened differently? Spoken differently? Assumed innocence instead of danger? The answers made him uncomfortable because deep down, he already knew them. Across the street, Linda Whitmore slowly stepped onto her porch again. This time nobody looked at her with fear or anger. Somehow that felt worse. Several wedding guests noticed her standing there uncertainly beneath the porch light. After a long hesitation, Linda finally crossed the street slowly with both hands folded nervously in front of her. Conversations quieted as she approached the edge of the backyard. Alicia noticed immediately. Marcus remained beside her as Linda stopped several feet away, looking smaller somehow than she had earlier behind the safety of her hedge and telephone call. "Miss Brooks," Linda said softly, barely able to maintain eye contact. I think I owe you an apology." The backyard remained silent. Linda's voice trembled slightly. "I convinced myself something dangerous was happening because I saw things that made me uncomfortable instead of asking questions first." Alicia studied her carefully. The older woman looked genuinely shaken. Now, not by authority, by realization. Linda glanced around at the lanterns, the dancing families, the children laughing near the fire pit. "I forgot neighbors are supposed to meet each other before fearing each other." Denise folded her arms tightly nearby, but remained silent. Alicia finally stepped forward slowly. "Do you know what hurt the most tonight?" Linda shook her head faintly. Alicia's voice stayed calm, but emotional. "It was realizing our happiness looked suspicious to somebody before they even knew us." Linda lowered her eyes immediately. The truth in those words cut through the night sharper than anger ever could. Alicia looked around at her family and friends gathered beneath glowing lights. This wedding was supposed to begin our life feeling welcomed here. She paused softly. Instead, it reminded us how quickly some people decide we do not belong. Tears filled Linda's eyes as she nodded silently. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Alicia reached toward the dessert table beside her and picked up a small plate of wedding cake. She handed it carefully to Linda. "The strawberry filling is better than the chocolate," she said quietly. Linda looked stunned, accepting the plate with shaking hands. And standing beneath lantern lights that reflected against wet grass and fading puddles, everyone watching understood something important at the exact same moment. Real dignity did not need revenge to prove its strength. The wedding carried on long after midnight, but the energy of the evening had transformed into something deeper than celebration alone. The lanterns glowing above the backyard no longer looked decorative. They looked symbolic, like tiny lights refusing to surrender to darkness, no matter how heavy the storm had been earlier. Music drifted softly through the cool night while guests gathered in smaller circles, speaking more honestly than they probably ever had before. Moments like this had a way of stripping people down to truth. Alicia sat near the garden fountain with her shoes kicked off beneath the chair, finally allowing herself to breathe after hours of emotional tension. Her wedding dress rested carefully around her while Marcus sat beside her with one arm draped protectively across the back of her chair. Neither of them spoke for a while. They simply listened to the sounds around them. Children laughing again, glasses clinking softly, older relatives singing quietly along with the jazz music. The neighborhood no longer felt hostile, just tired, human, healing. Alicia leaned her head gently against Marcus's shoulder. "Do you think tonight changes anything?" she asked quietly. Marcus understood exactly what she meant. Not just the wedding, the bigger question underneath it. The exhaustion Black families carried every time they entered certain neighborhoods, stores, schools, or public spaces, wondering whether they would be welcomed or watched. Marcus looked out across the backyard before answering carefully. "I think moments like this reveal things people usually hide from themselves." Alicia traced one finger slowly along the edge of her wedding ring. "I hated how fast I started feeling afraid when the police arrived," she admitted softly. "Not because I thought we did something wrong, because part of me already expected not to be believed." Marcus's expression tightened slightly. He hated hearing that pain in her voice because he understood it too well. As a Black officer who climbed through the ranks of law enforcement for more than 2 decades, He had spent years balancing two realities at once. One where he wore authority, another where his skin still made strangers question whether he belonged in expensive neighborhoods, upscale restaurants, or even his own uniform. You know what scares me most? Alicia continued quietly. The fact that everybody here understood exactly what was happening without needing it explained. Marcus nodded slowly. That was the tragedy of it. Nobody panicked because the situation felt unfamiliar. They panicked because it felt recognizable. Across the yard, Walter Gaines sat beside several younger guests sharing stories from the civil rights marches he attended with his parents as a child. The younger generation listened carefully, almost stunned hearing how many of the same emotional wounds still echoed decades later in different forms. Walter pointed gently toward the lantern-lit wedding around them. Progress is real, he said softly. But so is memory. Communities carry memory for generations. Nearby, Denise stood beside Linda Whitmore near the dessert table in a conversation nobody would have imagined possible just hours earlier. Linda still looked emotionally shaken, her eyes swollen slightly from crying after Alicia handed her that plate of cake. I keep replaying everything in my head, Linda admitted quietly. I really convinced myself I was protecting the neighborhood. Denise folded napkins carefully while listening. Fear can feel righteous when people never examine where it comes from, she replied calmly. Linda looked down. I saw a large black gathering and immediately assumed something was wrong. Saying the words aloud seemed to hurt her now. Denise nodded honestly. At least now you hear how ugly it sounds outside your own head. Linda flinched slightly because she knew Denise was right. Near the driveway, Officer Harper finally walked back toward the backyard one last time before leaving. The younger officer remained waiting in the patrol car with the engine running softly, while Harper approached Marcus and Alicia with visible hesitation. Marcus looked up calmly as Harper stopped a few feet away. Captain, Harper said quietly, before I leave, there is something I need to say directly to both of you. Alicia sat up slightly, but remained silent. Harper took a slow breath. Tonight forced me to confront something ugly in myself that I spent years pretending was just instinct or caution. His voice remained low and honest now, but instinct shaped by bias is still bias. The backyard nearby continued glowing with music and laughter while nobody interrupted him. Harper looked toward Alicia directly. You deserve to feel safe tonight. Celebrated. Respected. His throat tightened briefly. Instead, I made you feel investigated in your own backyard. Alicia studied him carefully for several seconds before answering. The hardest part was not your suspicion, she said softly. It was realizing how normal it felt to you when you first arrived. Harper lowered his eyes immediately because there was no defense against truth spoken that calmly. A breeze moved gently through the lanterns overhead while Marcus finally stepped closer beside his wife. Change does not happen because somebody gets embarrassed once, Marcus said quietly. It happens when people refuse to forget what they learned afterward. Harper nodded slowly beneath the fading glow of the patrol lights. And standing there in the middle of a wedding he almost ruined because of assumptions he never questioned before, he realized something that would stay with him long after the music stopped. Sometimes the most important mirror a person ever faces is the one held up by the people they underestimated. By 1:30 in the morning, the wedding had settled into the kind of quiet happiness that only comes after people survive something difficult together. The earlier tension no longer dominated the atmosphere, but traces of it remained woven into every conversation, every lingering glance, every extra hug exchanged beneath the lantern lights. The backyard looked softer now under the deep navy sky. Rainwater shimmered along the stone paths while jazz music floated gently through the cool air like a steady heartbeat refusing to fade. Alicia stood near the edge of the garden watching guests dance slowly beneath glowing strings of lights. Her wedding shoes remained abandoned near the fountain where she left them earlier, and the bottom of her dress carried small stains from wet grass and puddles. Surprisingly, she no longer cared. Hours ago, she would have worried about every detail being perfect. Now perfection felt less important than peace. Marcus walked up behind her quietly and wrapped one arm gently around her waist. You disappeared, he said softly. Alicia leaned back against him. I just needed a minute to think. Marcus followed her gaze toward the dance floor, where Denise laughed loudly while teaching several younger cousins old family dance steps. Even Walter Gaines was moving slowly beside the dessert table with surprising rhythm for a man nearly 70 years old. The sight made Alicia smile faintly. "You know," she said quietly, "when the police cars first pulled up tonight, I thought the whole wedding was ruined." Marcus kissed the side of her forehead softly. "I know." Alicia looked down at her ring again, the diamond catching reflections from the lanterns overhead. "But now I think maybe everybody here will remember this night, for a different reason." Marcus studied her expression carefully. "Because we got through it?" Alicia nodded slowly. "Because people showed who they really were." The words lingered between them while soft music drifted across the yard. Some people revealed prejudice. Some revealed courage. Some revealed compassion. And some, unexpectedly, revealed the ability to change. Near the curb, Officer Harper finally prepared to leave for real this time. The younger officer remained patiently inside the cruiser while Harper stood beside the open door, staring quietly back toward the wedding one last time. The flashing lights had long been turned off now, leaving the police car looking strangely ordinary beneath the street lamps. Harper no longer looked like a man carrying authority. He looked like a man carrying reflection. Before getting into the vehicle, he noticed Linda Whitmore still standing near the sidewalk, holding the untouched plate of strawberry cake Alicia had given her earlier. Most of the frosting had melted slightly from the humid night air. Harper hesitated briefly before walking toward her. Linda looked up nervously when she noticed him approaching. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Harper glanced toward the wedding behind them. "You know," he said quietly, "when dispatch called this in, I already pictured trouble before I even arrived." Linda looked down at the plate in her hands. "So did I." Their honesty sat painfully between them because both understood now how easily fear disguises itself as responsibility. Linda's voice cracked slightly. "I think I spent so many years convincing myself I was protecting the neighborhood that I stopped recognizing when I was actually protecting my own prejudice." Harper exhaled slowly. "Tonight forced me to see something similar." Across the street, laughter rose again beneath the lanterns while Marcus pulled Alicia gently back onto the dance floor for one final slow song of the evening. The guests formed a loose circle around them, smiling softly as the newly married couple swayed together beneath the warm lights. No fancy choreography, no dramatic moment, just two people holding on to each other after a night that tried very hard to shake their joy apart. Harper watched quietly from the sidewalk. "You know what bothers me most?" he admitted after a long silence. Linda looked at him. If Captain Reed had not stepped out there tonight, he stopped himself briefly. "I probably never would have questioned any of my assumptions." Linda nodded faintly because she understood exactly what he meant. Authority changed the outcome. Recognition changed the treatment. But dignity should never depend on either one. Alicia rested her head gently against Marcus's chest while they danced slowly beneath the lantern glow. "Do you regret inviting the whole neighborhood?" Marcus asked softly, teasing her slightly. Alicia laughed quietly for the first time, without sadness hiding underneath it. "Maybe just one house on the block." Marcus smiled. "Fair enough." The music continued drifting softly through the cool night, while guests began gathering sparklers for the couple's farewell exit. Tiny lights flickered to life one by one across the backyard, like stars slowly appearing after a storm. Harper finally opened the patrol car door and paused before getting inside. He looked back, toward the celebration again, toward Alicia laughing beside her family, toward Marcus standing tall without bitterness, toward a community that responded to humiliation not with revenge, but with dignity powerful enough to expose everybody else's reflection in the process. And as the patrol car slowly pulled away from the curb beneath the sleeping Georgia sky, Harper realized something he would carry long after tonight disappeared into memory. Sometimes the loudest lesson in justice arrives without handcuffs, shouting, or punishment. Sometimes it arrives through the quiet shame of realizing somebody treated you with more grace than you deserved. The final guests did not leave until nearly 3 in the morning. One by one, cars slowly disappeared down the quiet Georgia street while lanterns continued glowing softly across the backyard, like stubborn little pieces of warmth refusing to go dark. The wedding had become something nobody there would ever forget. Not because of elegance or decorations or perfect photographs. Because somewhere between humiliation and healing, everybody present witnessed the difference between power and dignity. Alicia stood barefoot on the damp grass watching relatives hug goodbye near the driveway. Her body ached with exhaustion now, but emotionally, she felt strangely lighter than earlier in the night. The fear and embarrassment that had wrapped tightly around her chest when the patrol cars first arrived no longer controlled her breathing. It had been replaced by something calmer. Clarity. Marcus walked out carrying a cardboard box filled with leftover decorations and half-melted candles. "Your cousin stole half the peach cobbler," he said softly with a tired smile. Alicia laughed quietly. "That means the wedding was successful." Marcus set the box down near the patio steps and looked around the backyard slowly. Empty chairs, wet flower petals scattered across the grass, sparkler sticks abandoned near the fence. The remains of a night that somehow survived everything thrown against it. Alicia followed his gaze. "It still feels unreal." Marcus nodded once. Most moments that reveal people clearly usually do. They stood together silently for a while listening to cicadas hum beneath the cooling night air. Somewhere down the block, a porch light flicked off. The neighborhood had gone still again. But it did not feel like the same street anymore. Across the road, Linda Whitmore remained sitting alone on her front porch wrapped in a gray sweater despite the warm temperature. The untouched plate of strawberry cake still rested beside her. She had not gone back inside for almost an hour. Every now and then she glanced toward Alicia and Marcus's house, where soft music still played quietly while family members cleaned up the reception together. She thought about all the stories she invented in her mind before making that 911 call. Suspicious crowd, unsafe gathering, loud people causing problems. None of it had been real. It was fear shaped by assumptions she inherited so long ago she stopped recognizing them as prejudice. And tonight, for the first time in years, she was forced to sit alone with that truth. Meanwhile, several miles away, Officer Harper drove through nearly empty streets beneath fading streetlights with the radio turned completely off. Silence filled the patrol car while the city drifted past his windows in dark shapes and reflections. He could not stop replaying the night in his head. Alicia standing in her wedding dress beneath flashing lights. Marcus stepping calmly into the yard. The shame he felt when he realized how quickly he had viewed black celebration through suspicion instead of humanity. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. What unsettled him most was not being corrected by his captain. It was realizing how easily his mind filled gaps with stereotypes before facts ever appeared. At a red light downtown, Harper suddenly remembered something from police academy training nearly 15 years earlier. One instructor had once said, "The most dangerous officers are not always the angry ones. Sometimes they are the ones who never question their own instincts." Back then, Harper dismissed the comment as abstract philosophy. Tonight it sounded painfully personal. Back at the house, Alicia slowly sat beside the nearly extinguished fire pit while Marcus handed her a blanket from inside. The flames flickered low against the cool night air as they watched Denise and Walter laugh together while stacking folding chairs near the garden gate. "Do you think people really change?" Alicia asked softly after a long silence. Marcus sat beside her carefully. "Sometimes. And sometimes." Marcus looked toward the empty street where the patrol cars once stood. "Sometimes they only become quieter versions of the same person." Alicia pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "I want to believe tonight mattered." Marcus turned toward her fully. "It mattered because you refused to let bitterness become the ending." The words settled gently over the crackling fire. Alicia looked down at her wedding ring reflecting tiny flashes of orange light. She thought about the moment she handed Linda that slice of cake instead of anger. About Walter offering coffee to the officer who humiliated them. About Marcus choosing calm when authority could have easily turned cruel. Dignity had moved through the night stronger than humiliation ever did. Near the backyard gate, Denise suddenly smiled watching the newly married couple sitting together beneath the lanterns. "You know," she whispered softly to Walter, "they almost ruined this wedding." Walter looked toward Alicia and Marcus quietly. Then he shook his head. "No," he replied calmly. "They revealed why this marriage is going to survive anything." The last lantern swayed gently overhead while the fire pit crackled lower into glowing embers. And beneath the quiet Georgia sky, surrounded by the people who stayed when things became uncomfortable, Alicia finally understood something important. The real strength of a community is not measured by how loudly it celebrates during easy moments. It is measured by who still stands beside you after the lights turn harsh and the world starts questioning whether your joy belongs there at all. Morning arrived slowly over the neighborhood, washing the street in soft gold sunlight that made everything look calmer than it had the night before. The storm was gone completely now. Water still clung to tree branches and porch railings while birds moved through the humid Georgia air as if nothing extraordinary had happened there only hours earlier. But for the people who stood beneath those lantern lights the night before, something had changed permanently. Alicia woke just after 7, wrapped in a blanket on the backyard patio chair, where she and Marcus eventually fell asleep beside the dying fire pit. The lanterns above them had finally gone dark sometime before dawn, but traces of the wedding still remained everywhere she looked. Folded chairs stacked near the fence. Flower petals scattered across damp grass. Half-empty lemonade pitchers resting beside candle jars burned all the way down to melted wax. Marcus stirred beside her slowly, still wearing part of his tuxedo, shirt with the sleeves rolled unevenly to his elbows. Alicia smiled. Faintly. We fell asleep outside. Marcus rubbed his eyes tiredly before glancing around the backyard. Honestly, after last night, I am impressed we stayed awake long enough to make it this far. Alicia laughed softly. It was the first completely relaxed laugh she had given since before the police arrived. Marcus noticed immediately. There it is, he said quietly. What? Your real smile. Alicia looked down for a second. I think I forgot what it felt like for a while. Marcus reached for her hand gently. You do not have to carry last night forever. Alicia leaned back against the chair slowly. I know, but I also do not want to pretend it did not happen. The honesty in her voice lingered between them. Some experiences changed people because they were traumatic. Others changed people because they exposed truths impossible to ignore afterward. Across the street, Linda Whitmore stood quietly near her mailbox wearing an oversized sweater and holding a small plastic container in nervous hands. She stared toward Alicia and Marcus's house for several long seconds before finally walking across the street slowly. Alicia noticed her first. Marcus sat up calmly beside her as Linda stopped near the patio gate, looking uncertain and deeply uncomfortable. Good morning, Linda said softly. Alicia nodded politely. Morning. Linda held up the container awkwardly. I made blueberry muffins. The sentence sounded almost painfully small after everything that happened. Marcus exchanged a brief glance with Alicia before standing and opening the patio gate for her. Linda stepped inside cautiously like somebody entering sacred ground after violating it the night before. I did not sleep much, she admitted quietly. Alicia folded the blanket neatly across her lap while listening. Linda looked around at the remains of the wedding reception still scattered across the backyard. I kept thinking about how quickly I assumed the worst about people I never even introduced myself to. Her eyes filled slightly with emotion. And the truth is, if I had looked out that window and seen a white family celebrating exactly the same way, I never would have called the police. Silence settled softly over the patio because nobody there needed to argue with her honesty. Marcus leaned against the wooden railing nearby while morning sunlight stretched across the grass. Acknowledging that matters, he said calmly. Linda nodded faintly. But it also feels shameful. Alicia finally spoke gently. Growth usually begins there. Linda looked toward her with surprised gratitude. I do not expect forgiveness overnight. Alicia considered her words carefully. Forgiveness is not pretending something did not hurt, she said softly. It is deciding pain will not control what kind of person you become afterward. The backyard remained quiet except for birds rustling through nearby trees. Linda looked down at the wedding ring shining on Alicia's hand. You should have spent last night thinking about love, not proving you belonged in your own neighborhood. Alicia swallowed slowly because that sentence carried the exact heartbreak she had been unable to fully explain herself. Before anyone could respond, a familiar patrol car slowly rolled onto the street and parked near the curb. Alicia instinctively tensed for half a second before realizing it was only the younger officer from the night before stepping out, holding a large white bakery box. Marcus immediately recognized him. Officer Bennett, he said calmly. The young officer smiled awkwardly. Captain. He glanced toward Alicia and Linda before holding up the bakery box sheepishly. My wife made cinnamon rolls this morning after I told her what happened last night. Alicia blinked in surprise while Bennett continued carefully. She said nobody should wake up the morning after their wedding remembering police lights more than breakfast. Marcus smiled faintly for the first time. Bennett stepped closer and lowered his voice slightly. And Captain, Officer Harper requested reassignment from community response duty this morning. Alicia looked up quietly. Why? Bennett hesitated briefly. He told the lieutenant he needs to confront some things about himself before putting on that uniform in neighborhoods like this again. The morning breeze moved gently through the backyard, carrying the smell of fresh cinnamon and wet grass beneath the brightening sky. Alicia looked around at the people standing there together now. A neighbor learning accountability. An officer bringing kindness instead of suspicion. A husband who never let humiliation harden into bitterness. And for the first time since the patrol cars interrupted her wedding, Alicia finally felt something stronger than embarrassment settling into her chest. Hope. 3 weeks later, the neighborhood looked completely ordinary again on the surface. Lawns were trimmed. Mailboxes stood neatly beside quiet sidewalks. Children rode bicycles beneath the warm Georgia sun, while sprinklers clicked rhythmically across front yards in the late afternoon heat. But certain streets remember things long after the noise fades. And this street remembered the night flashing police lights interrupted a wedding because somebody mistook black joy for danger. Alicia stood in the front yard planting fresh white roses along the walkway leading to the porch, while soft soul music drifted from an open kitchen window behind her. She wore denim jeans now instead of a wedding dress, gardening gloves instead of diamond bracelets. But there was peace in her movements again. Real peace. Not the fragile kind people fake after pain. The kind rebuilt slowly after surviving humiliation without allowing it to poison your spirit. Marcus walked outside carrying 2 glasses of iced tea and smiled watching her struggle with a stubborn gardening shovel. You realize you married a captain, he teased gently. You could have requested backup. Alicia laughed softly. I do not trust your landscaping skills. Marcus placed the drinks down beside the porch steps, while sunlight reflected warmly against his wedding ring. The house behind them no longer felt like the place where their wedding almost collapsed beneath judgment and suspicion. It felt like home again. That mattered. Across the street, Linda Whitmore carefully hung a small welcome sign beside her porch door before stepping back to straighten it. Over the past 3 weeks, she had done something nobody expected. She started showing up. Not dramatically. Quietly. She brought over soup when Denise caught the flu. Helped clean folding tables left over from the reception. Introduced herself properly to neighbors she had lived beside for years without ever really knowing. It did not erase what happened, but it revealed effort. And effort mattered too. Further down the street, Officer Harper sat alone inside a parked sedan outside a small community center before finally stepping out wearing plain clothes instead of a police uniform. He looked nervous walking toward the front entrance where a weekly neighborhood listening forum was being held. A sign near the doorway read, Community Conversations, Building Trust Through Truth. Harper almost turned around twice before entering. But he stayed, because some lessons only matter if they continue after embarrassment fades. Inside the community center, residents from different neighborhoods sat in folding chairs sharing experiences with local officers, racial profiling, fear, mistrust, and exhaustion. Harper listened more than he spoke. An elderly black woman described teaching her grandson how to stay calm during traffic stops before he was even old enough to drive. A father explained how exhausting it felt constantly needing to prove his family belonged in certain spaces. Harper sat silently through all of it, hearing echoes of Alicia's wedding night in every story. Toward the end of the meeting, the moderator finally asked if anyone else wanted to speak. Harper hesitated before slowly raising his hand. The room grew quiet as he stood. 3 weeks ago, he began carefully. I responded to a wedding call in a neighborhood not far from here. His voice remained steady, but heavy. I thought I arrived prepared to stop trouble. He paused briefly. But the truth is, I arrived carrying assumptions I never questioned before. Nobody interrupted him. Harper looked around the room slowly. And the worst part is, I thought those assumptions were professionalism. Silence settled over the chairs while several people listened with guarded expressions. Harper nodded faintly to himself before continuing. That night forced me to realize something difficult. Bias does not always look like hatred. Sometimes it looks like instinct. People stop examining because it feels normal. A few people lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Others simply watched quietly. Harper exhaled slowly. I embarrassed innocent people during one of the most important moments of their lives, Because I saw black celebration and treated it like suspicion before I saw humanity first. The room remained silent for several seconds after he finished speaking. Then slowly, an older man near the back nodded once. Not forgiveness. Not approval. Recognition. Across town later that evening, Alicia and Marcus sat together on their porch swing, watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in soft orange light. Cicadas hummed through the warm air, while sprinklers clicked lazily somewhere nearby. Alicia rested her head against Marcus's shoulder. "Do you ever wish none of it happened?" she asked quietly. Marcus thought about it carefully before answering. "I wish you never had to feel humiliated on our wedding night." Alicia nodded softly. "But—" Marcus looked out across the street where Linda waved awkwardly while carrying groceries inside. "But sometimes truth only reveals itself when comfort disappears." Alicia sat silently for a moment, letting his words settle inside her. The world had tried to interrupt their joy with suspicion, tried to make them feel unwelcome in a place they worked hard to call home. But in the end, something else survived longer than humiliation did. Dignity, community, accountability, growth. The porch swing moved gently beneath the fading Georgia sunlight, while Marcus squeezed Alicia's hand softly. And somewhere beyond the quiet neighborhood streets and fading storm memories, one truth remained standing stronger than everything else. He wore a badge believing power made him important. But that night, a woman in a wedding dress reminded everyone watching what real authority actually looks like.